Satya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nina. And greetings, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to this last of the three-part series Nexus Dialogue. We started on the 14th of July on pollution and waste. Yesterday was Building Back Better for a Sustainable Future. And today, of course, is the big elephant in the room, system resiliency and health-related dependencies, which is what COVID-19 is all about. By the end of this conversation today, it'll be fantastic if we all walk away with a greater understanding of what it is that we are talking about. Are we talking in silos? Are we talking in connection with ecosystems or biodiversity or economics or growth and prosperity, or everything is interconnected as COVID-19 has laid bare? As you know, our special Nexus Dialogue series provides an opportunity for UN agencies to broaden their reach, share their views and perspectives, and of course the capacity building efforts. Each agency is doing something meaningful, not just to put their best foot forward, but also in terms of the UN system being better than the sum of its parts, and in that working with each other to produce outstanding results for people and planet. And this Nexus Dialogue series builds on the SG's recent reports on the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19. As you know, that the SG has issued a socioeconomic recovery framework along 4 pillars, and that along with the UNEP's own COVID-19 4-pillar response, is a formidable tool in the arsenal of policy planners, both at a country level, at a regional level, and a global level, to bring the best possible assistance to people that are in great distress at this time. And today's dialogue will focus on healthcare systems, how they began to fail, and how did the resiliency of social, economic, and political systems. We can talk about poverty, equity, we can talk about climate, nature, gender mainstreaming, educational system, decent labor, and peaceful, strong institutions. Yesterday, I was in a conversation at the UN headquarters with the senior leadership of the UN on this shrinking of the civic space, and COVID-19, how it is contributing to that, which is, and everybody lamented that in the absence of civic space, we lose much of the strength we have as a community, as people, and all of that then colludes and conspires in the wrong way to affect the governance of environmental resources. And then, as we know, that like with the brown economy, in a green economy, it's all about stocks and flows in nature. So if you're depleting your stocks beyond its regenerative ability that the flows bring about, and effective utilization of the flows brings about, we stand to lose much more than the stocks alone, because everything else is interconnected. And to keep up the momentum, there will be an outcome report coming out of this and the other Nexus Dialogues, presenting key findings, and that of course will feed into the post-2020 intergovernmental processes. So welcome to today's Nexus Dialogue, and thank you, dear colleagues, for your expert perspectives that will not just help us as a UN community, but since everything is being recorded and will be shared in public, so even people would, even those that are not signed on now, would greatly benefit as they go back into the archives and listen to your expert perspectives. So thank you, welcome, and looking forward to great discussions this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Satya, for these sort of guidances and the directions that you have shared with us that will help us also to sort of structure our discussion to address sort of to ensure that they are related to addressing global environmental issues, and ensuring that the discussion will lead into further interagency collaboration understanding each other capacities and added value, and also understanding the gaps that we will have to cover in addressing environment, health in particular, and in that context, the COVID pandemic. This discussion today is not so sort of strange to us in terms of our sort of previous work by the UN environment, or also in the UN system on the environment and health, which has been a very strong nexus over which the UN system has worked a lot, and UN environment obviously has been working closely with WHO. But now we have a new sort of factor here, which is COVID, and sort of communicable disease, which has come to the play, and it will be very useful for our discussion today to understand how much the current nexus, the deliberations over environment and health, has actually taken into account the phenomena such as this, and whether or not they have to be more inclusive in terms of addressing nature-based solutions or ecosystems into the future, thinking on environment and health nexus. At least from our experience so far in the last few years in the EMG, one very strong common denominator in bringing all the sectors together has been human well-being. So that is the very important common denominator for us, to ensure that we bring all agencies together. And I think the COVID here creates an opportunity for us even to strengthen this common denominator. So with that, I would like to pass it to Kaveh Madani, who has helped the EMG in the past when he was in the Imperial College, with his knowledge of system understanding and complex system understanding. And that helped us also to decompose the very complex nexuses and to understand the interlinkages, understand the capacities, and also areas which requires further thinking. So Kaveh is now with Yale University, and we are very much thankful to him who has accepted to moderate today's dialogue, as well as the last two dialogues yesterday and the day before yesterday. And hopefully with his abilities, we would be able to have a very fruitful discussion, obviously with the very distinguished panelists that have also kindly accepted to join us. So over to you, Kaveh, and good luck with the discussion today.
Thank you, Hussein, for such a kind introduction. It's a pleasure interacting and working with UN EMG, and as well as the rest of the UN family. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all the attendees, the esteemed panelists who have joined us from different parts of the world. As yesterday and the day before, we have a very esteemed group of panelists and a diverse group of attendees who have common concerns and common goals. And we are going through a crisis which has helped us to actually, or provide opportunities, provides an opportunity for us to unite further, because now we understand the common enemies, we understand how interconnected the world is, and we have a proof for a lot of things that we have been telling the world about, telling the politicians about, telling the general public about. And you know, for many years in the environmental community, we have felt that we are getting dismissed. Now there is a proof, and we can prove that, you know, how we are linked to each other, and how the resilience of the system can be threatened by a failure in part of the system. We are seeing how the environmental sector is being impacted by a failure in the health sector. We were talking about many crises in the environmental space, but I would say that at least in the scientific community that I now work with, we have not been I think even in our worst scenarios and projections of the future, we were not seeing a crisis like this coming. And now we know how vulnerable human societies are, how vulnerable our economies are, no matter how strong our military units are, and no matter how strong our politicians are in the, you know, global arena. We can be threatened by a tiny and invisible virus, and systems are failing. Politicians are under threat. We are seeing conflicts, demonstrations, and a lot of problems around the world. It started with health, then the challenge of decision making and response to a health issue came up. Do we shut down? Do we keep our economies going? Because at the end of the day, we also want people to be able to survive, the denominator that Hussein talked about. We realize that everything is connected. Poor economies have a harder time coping with the crisis because their resilience might, their capacity to respond and resilience might be less. So we are seeing these problems after the second wave, which is believed to be economy. We are now talking about a serious crisis in the food sector. Some of the discussions yesterday was about this, and we heard a lot of crazy and dramatic numbers and projections of the future, and more things coming up. In the environmental sector, the early response was that a lot of people interpreted this as the gift of the nature to, of course, remind us that the business as usual might not work, but also the kind of image that was drawn or projected by the media and some people was that, yes, look at the blue skies, look at the species that have come to streets, look at the how the nature is flourishing, and yes, those stories are true, but the question is how sustainable they are and going forward, if that will be permanent. But what we know in the environmental community is that actually in the environmental sector is under threat. The current crisis is overshadowing a lot of discussions that we have, and then as there is more pressure on economies and there is more pressure on governments, their attention to the environmental and societies, their attention to the environmental sector might become more and more limited, and this is a serious threat. But today we are here to discuss the interlinkages between different sectors, what we have learned from this crisis, how we were impacted by issues in the health sector, and what can we learn and how we can do better in the future. And I keep emphasizing on what Hussein said, that the common denominator is human viability, human systems. We want to make sure that this is the selfish part of us, that we, at the end of the day, we are concerned about human survival, even though we say we're equal to the other species on Earth, but we are trying very hard to survive and exist on this planet, even though we know that the planet can exist without us. So with that, I want to thank take this opportunity to thank UNEMG for starting this dialogue, for creating this opportunity that we have physical distancing, but our love for the planet, for the environment, has not decreased, and the opportunities to cooperate has not been limited. Fortunately, we have the virtual world, and even maybe managing and running 3 dialogues in a row would have been with such an impressive group of panelists would have been impossible in regular times. But this is an opportunity that we get everyone online to speak about the things that matter. Right now we have more than 50 participants. In the last few days we saw bigger numbers as well. This is great, and the videos would be online. That that the videos of yesterday and the day before are on the EMG website and YouTube. You can search for them, and today's session will be also recorded and posted. So if you have connection issues, don't worry. As we go forward, the attendees have the chance of asking questions through the Q&A function, and our panelists would be responding to your questions through text. They will type responses back, and they will also take your questions into account when responding to my questions, and we will also respond to your questions later on during the session. Thank you, Satya. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Hussein, for and all the people behind the scenes for this opportunity, and thank you, the dear panelists for joining today. I want to go around and ask the panelists to introduce themselves briefly and tell us who they are and why they are here. Manal.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much, esteemed panelists, and thank you to the EMG as well. I'm Manal Azzi. I'm an occupational safety and health specialist working at the International Labour Organization based at the headquarters in Geneva. Obviously, the ILO has had a leading role to play in keeping our workplaces across all sectors safe and healthy during the COVID-19 crisis and beyond. But also, occupational safety and health has had to step up and be leaders in health surveillance and monitoring in workplaces, but also linking to public health systems and to general environmental interventions. And the ILO has been working heavily in the area of chemicals. And we do know that various sectors have practices and make decisions that can not only impact their own workers, but impact the environments in which they function and in the communities where they lie. So the role of ILO in this and occupational safety and health moving forward, we find is critical. And I think that's why I've been invited to this panel. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Thanks for joining us, Manal. Now let's go to Cristina.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank you all for the invitation. So my name is Cristina, and I work with the World Health Organization. I have a pretty unique role. I'm the Interagency Liaison for Biodiversity, Climate Change, and Health. And throughout the years, I have coordinated the joint work program on biodiversity and health between the WHO and the Convention on Biological Diversity, which also brings together a whole host of other partners. So, but I am based at the World Health Organization primarily. So this really does sit, this topic today, the ones that have taken place over the course of the last 3 days actually really does sit at the heart of, you know, both of these different worlds, if you will. And it's great to see them come together and great to be amongst all of the other panelists as well.
Thanks. It's great to have you with us today. Monika. Monika, you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. I was pressing the wrong unmute button. My sincere apologies. Thank you very much, Kaveh, and thank you very much for the invitation to UNEP to join this panel. I am Monika Mcdevitt, and I'm the chief of the Chemicals and Health branch that sits within the Economy Division at the UN Environment Program based in Geneva. And I would like to just give you a little bit of a background and sort of complement a little bit what perhaps Cristina has said, in that many of the things that we do within not only this division, but within UNEP are very multidisciplinary. And although we focus very much and primarily on the environment, we also have the responsibility to show the linkages between the environment and environmental health, stewardship, and well-being with human health and how that interacts. And so I think we need to look at the role that UNEP plays very much at that nexus and what we can offer in terms of the ability to see the connections between environment and health and beyond perhaps biodiversity, which is an incredibly important part of what we're going to be discussing, I think. And with the topic of resiliency, we really need to look at a healthy environment as being an important component of resiliency within times of pandemics that have especially come from zoonotic sources. So I think we need to keep that in mind as well as we go on here, and we'll expand on that during the question and answer period. But in terms of what UNEP brings to the table, we have very specific resolutions and mandates from our member states that have asked us to look at issues that work at the Nexus, particularly on pollution. And that's something that we'll be talking about a bit more. Thanks.
Thank you, Monika. It's great to have you with us. Alice.
Hi everyone, I'm Alice Ruhweza. I am the Africa Region Director for the Worldwide Fund for Nature. Pleased to be here. I'm based in Nairobi. Our mission is to ensure that people live in harmony with nature. And COVID-19 is a perfect example where for people currently probably not living in harmony with nature. For this topic, we are very much interested in understanding from the conservation point of view, the key drivers that are influencing the risk of these zoonotic disease emergencies. We've been warned from a long time ago that the pandemics would come up and that there would be a problem. And it has come to be, and therefore we spent the last months also trying to understand this and also trying to understand how we in the conservation sector can work better with the health sector and the animal health sector to prevent future pandemics. So I look forward to discussing this today. Over.
Thank you, Alice. It's great to have you with us. And last but not least, Robert.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to UNEMG for the invite to be part of this panel. Myself, I am currently a team leader based here in Asia for GIZ, which is a project that's working with the Lao government on the protection and sustainable use of forest ecosystems and biodiversity. And I'm one of the team leaders of 3 components. So we have component on FLECT on the timber legality trade, also on co-management of protected areas, and then finally environmental education and awareness and illegal wildlife trade. And then I'm the team leader for that last one. Right now I'm working a bit virtually from Thailand, which is my home here because of the COVID situation. But I work with my Lao team and I'm waiting to go back to Lao anytime I'm allowed. But I think the reason that I'm invited because of my experience and application of system thinking. So I have a consultancy that's called Sustainability Asia. Rather than SUS, it's SYS with the emphasis on systems. So for the past 15, 16 years, I've been working in the Asia region with various agencies from UNEP to UNDP, UNSCAP, ADB, so forth, on practical system thinking integration, whether it's training of government leaders or policy interventions, policy cohesion around Asia. So I think Nina, I worked with Nina when she was at UNSCAP on quantitative system modeling around SDG 6. And then also later on around Mongolia, developing Mongolia's sustainability outlook, but integrating system mapping into bringing together the different ministry sectors to look at policy coherence. So I think for this topic of system resiliency and health interdependencies, system thinking is a critical mindset and a critical skill. And it's something that really will bring together all the agencies and shared learning, shared understanding of the problem, plus mapping out where are our leverage points, how can we coordinate our interventions, how can we understand the synergies and trade-offs that are potentially there so we can maximize our actions. So I thank you for this opportunity, and I'm really thrilled to listen, learn, and contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. It's great to have you with us, and thanks for promoting the systems thinking and system science. So as someone in this community, I'm thankful for it, and I've been talking to the media about it, saying that what is happening right now, despite all its negative aspects, it's a great example for us from now on to teach in classes, to talk about the interdependencies and interlinkages and how things can fail one after another. We heard about the connections from of this crisis to other matters, and why we are here from Satya and Hossein. But we also want to talk about how to analyze and understand the problems, how to deal with the problems in a better way. So today is a I think good discussion for those interested in interdisciplinary science and decision-making under uncertainty, systems thinking, nexus, system of systems, and all these concepts that have been proposed as we have understood more and more about the complexity of human nature systems that we are dealing with, how to navigate through, and how to do a better job and sustain life on the planet. But one purpose of being here today is also learning about the different things that are happening at different organizations, and promoting cooperation and identifying opportunities for future cooperation and resource pooling. So as we go forward, please refer to the work that you are doing, and if there is material that the public and the attendees can benefit from, please share them through the Q&A or the chat section, so people can download them and learn about what you're doing at your agencies. So start that first. I asked the first question. Now we know about all these problems, so what have you been doing at your agencies? What are the recent science policy discussions in your system about system resilience, in your agencies about system resiliency and health-related interdependencies? Please mute your, we're hearing some background noise. Please mute your mics if you're not speaking. So Manal,
yes. Thank you for that question. I mean, the ILO sees critical health-related interdependencies, obviously, with many aspects of the world of work as a whole. So first of all, between workplace health and public health, it becomes increasingly clear that unhealthy workplaces anywhere truly pose a threat to public health everywhere. And if we look at the trends of infection, for example, of COVID-19 in workplaces where there's high density of workers, we see that workplace health and public health has never been more interrelated. As such, we're reminded that OSH, occupational safety health, is a core aspect of decent work, and therefore it must be the foundation for building resiliency in the labor market, but also in the global economies as a whole. We also see that social protection systems have never been more important. So building risk-informed and shock-responsive social protection system has been recognized as a critical strategy in strengthening resilience in the world of work in general and protecting humans globally. So discussions on these topics at the ILO happen with our social partners, which are worker organizations, employer organizations that have a huge duty and responsibility to take action, but also member states and ministries, and mostly ministries of labor that we work with. But we ensure that all of our social partners come together to make any such decision. We've been, developing a number of technical policy briefs focused on various labor-related themes. The impact on job losses globally has been enormous and affecting people around the world. So we've structured our key policy messages around 4 pillars. One is stimulating the economy and employment. The second one is supporting enterprises and jobs and incomes to keep people's jobs and to keep enterprises, small, medium enterprises, those in the informal economy, we need to keep them going, but also protecting workers in the workplace so we can see a normal return, what the ILO is calling a better normal return to work. Work arrangements have changed, and as we heard our colleague earlier talking about, spending more time at home, people, are up to sometimes good and up to no good in terms of the choices they make and decisions they make that may affect their homes, which in many cases have become their workplaces. So there's lots of changes in working time, working arrangements, and choices we make that will affect the economy globally. And relying on social dialogue. So we continue to rely on social dialogue dialogue for finding solutions between workers, employers, and ministries of labor. So these 4 pillars, we find them interrelated and complementary, and emphasize that collaboration across various systems is quite essential. Some policy actions, for example, like social protection, not only support jobs and incomes, but also protect workers in the workplace. And so a lot of these issues are very cross-cutting. I mean, this is just to give you an idea of, you know, some of the policy streams that we're looking into to support jobs, support health, and support the environment as we move forward out of this crisis.
Thank you, thank you. You know, we always hear about the problems with the way we run our economy and create jobs and its impacts on the environment, but this time, I think more and more people in the environmental community, at least, would learn the real challenge, because at the end of the day, as you know, we saw like how worried we became about unemployment and people losing jobs and losing their economic resiliency. And that is something very important, because as countries go under more and more economic pressure, they might become more natural resource dependent. So we are discussing the idea of building back better, but if we want to do things as before, this situation would not necessarily become better. And that's something to take into account. And now the same question to Cristina.
Thank you so much, Kaveh. I'm going to try to keep it super brief, actually, and try to stick to the 2 minutes. I think that ultimately it really comes as no surprise to anybody on the call that WHO health sector interdependencies and resilience have been at the very heart of what we do, and raison d'être essentially for decades. That said, though, I mean, I think that this question comes at an exceptionally extraordinary moment, you know, in modern history. I think it's pretty safe to say that the COVID-19 crisis has been a real teaching moment for many sectors, and it really brought for so many individuals into very sharp focus on a truly global and unprecedented scale how intimately connected we really are with each other, but also with other living beings and with the ecosystems that essentially sustain us. You know, over the past decade, WHO has really strengthened its commitment, as I mentioned before, to working together with other partners, including the CBD Secretariat under the Joint Work Program on Biodiversity and Health, and a great many other partners. And a lot of the work that is done under that Joint Work Program, or that is, you know, that is currently being spearheaded under that Joint Work Program, really cuts across a lot of the issues that we're struggling with and facing at a global scale right now. So I won't have a chance to go through the details of them right now, but since this is an iterative panel, we'll probably come back to some elements of that at some point. I'll provide a couple of concrete examples of how we've strengthened these collaborative ties. Very recent, because you asked about very recent targeted actions that have been taken. So one example is a very recent meeting of the Interagency Liaison Group on Biodiversity and Health, which essentially brings together a very diverse group of international stakeholders that are working at the nexus of not just biodiversity and health and not just environment and health, although primarily, but also working on climate change, also the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health. So it really does bring together it's a very large collaborative group to think about the very hard questions. And these questions are essentially around how do we frame these common narratives? And I'm sure this is something that I'm going to come back to at subsequent point in the meeting. So in addition to that, in addition to that meeting in which we were talking precisely about how do we shape the narrative around biodiversity and health in the era of COVID-19, it's not just about the relationship between biodiversity and infectious diseases. It's also about creating health promoting environments. So another one of the tools that we've delivered very recently on World Environment Day, actually, is we published guidance on mainstreaming biodiversity for nutrition and health, in which we specifically identify 6 core building blocks. It's quite a dense document, so I'd be very happy to put the link into the into the chat box if anybody's interested. But essentially, we identify 6 core building blocks for mainstreaming biodiversity for nutrition and health, with some very concrete actions and some very concrete entry points on how to transform food systems. And last point that we can come back to later, I hope all of you on this in this webinar have seen the WHO manifesto for a healthy and green recovery, which also has 6 critically important pillars. I won't go through all of them right now. Suffice it to say that the first is on nature.
You're about 5 minutes.
My goodness.
Yes. Yeah. So please finish your sentence. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I muted myself in the midst of that. So I just did. My last sentence was, suffice it to say that the first pillar is on nature.
Thank you. So you know, the panelists, I think one of the things you can do is also, if you have material to add, you can always type, and tell us more about what you're doing, and these will also go into the report of this session. So it would be permanent, and please share what you have been doing and what you think is important for others to learn. You know, this also came up yesterday. We also want to maximize the return, per dollar spent by the UN system. So it is good that people learn about what is happening, so we don't necessarily parallel process and do the same research at different places. So thank you, Cristina, and let's now go to Monika.
Thanks very much again, Kaveh. Yeah, I'll try to stick within our time limit here. And the question was around the science policy efforts that are being put into place. Well, literally everything that UNEP does is based on a very sound science to policy basis. And we have a number of different platforms and frameworks, but I think the ones that are most relevant to the current situation and talking about resiliency have been the work through our Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which has often raised the need to be cautious around what's happening in the environment. The International Resource Panel also helps bring in a lot of information around how we must better use our resources to maintain that resiliency and that sustainability, Geo6 and all that. But I think the more relevant ones are around the Beyond 2020 frameworks that are, of course, coming up to an end at the end of 2020, and that being the one on sound management of chemicals and waste, and also the Biodiversity Beyond 2020 framework. And what we're trying to do there is to use this opportunity of a pandemic, because we can't just create it ourselves, but to use this opportunity to say, look, it's really important to take the best science policy advice that we have in different areas, chemicals and waste, and that of biodiversity, and say, where are those opportunities for linking the two and looking at how we can harmonize some of the science policy knowledge and information that we have, so that we have stronger policy frameworks from which to go forward. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, and it's a very active conversation that's happening now. And I think we need to look at nature-based solutions, and this year has often been touted as the super year for nature because of the call to incorporate nature-based solutions in tackling climate change. But it goes well beyond that in terms of how we look at nature-based solutions for resiliency. And here's an opportunity to look at healthy ecosystems and healthy people and the contributions there, the science that underpins them, and how do we relook at policy and how do we shape policy to ensure that we have that strengthened platform for governments to take forward in a very thought through and very interconnected way. So I think those are the sort of policy dialogues that we've been having. And I'll just put in a little note here, and I know I've gone over my 2 minutes, but the SciChem, or the Strategic Approach to Integrated Chemicals Management, is postponing its big conference until next year because of COVID, but that gives us the opportunity to do a lot of outreach. And I think we need to participate in that and make sure that we are using this opportunity to say, how can we better go forward and make better decisions when we do meet up and have the important global conference in July of 2021. So I'll leave it at that and carry on.
Thank you so much. And you know, this is very important. Thanks for bringing it up going forward. And I think we'll discuss this in the next 2 questions. But we have the conferences of the parties coming up and different conventions and gatherings. And now that, as Cristina mentioned, we understand the need for developing a new narrative, and we have the capital to invest, you know, to take advantage of, because of all the lessons learned, all the evidence, to build that narrative. How can we use the opportunity that has been created, the window of opportunity that comes with every crisis, to you know, move in a different direction? You know, we are talking about complexity and interlinkages and trade-offs and so on. One thing to note is that the first thing we teach in systems class is that complex problems don't have a solution. So if you're looking for a solution, you are doing the wrong thing. It's really hard to find, you know, one root cause for the problem. What we need to do is to learn how to navigate through the problem and to do better. As we go forward, we learn more and more. We learn more and more about the unintended consequences of some of our good actions and good decisions. We learn more about the problems that are created, the things that we didn't see. Our understanding of justice, freedom, equality, and things like this will also change. Our definition of sustainability changes. So we never should claim that we know all the solution. We have to set, you know, valid guidelines and practical guidelines to get things done in a better way and help the nations and governments and the general public navigate through this, the complex system. Now let's go to Alice.
Thank you very much. It's hard to build on all the richness that has already gone. So I'll talk a little bit about wildlife and zoonotics. The conversation when it first started was about COVID coming out of a live market that sells, a live market actually, that sells bush meat. So in many ways, it started out with a conversation that is related to the work that we do in conservation, very much that in more ways that led to a health challenge. So we at WWF, we've spent some of this time trying to identify the drivers, what the drivers are for these pandemics. And as others have said earlier, is that we've been warned, I think, way back that this was a risk that was coming along. In fact, I think the science says every 4 months there's the potential of a pandemic. And 3 main drivers really, which are very much related to the work that we do: the land use change, whether it's deforestation, the expansion and intensification of agriculture and animal production, mostly for food, and the sale and consumption of high-risk wild animals in and out of live markets. And you know, wildlife in many ways, it's also around the increasing demand worldwide for animal protein as well. So it's not just for sale of wildlife, but it's also for animal protein. And wildlife is a source of animal protein. It's a source of medicine in some cultures, ornaments, clothing, and all of that. So there's a lot of interconnections here. There's also the interconnection in terms of these zoonotic diseases also have a big threat to wildlife. The gorilla tourism parks were closed right away because back in when Ebola came out in between 1997 and 2004, there was increased death of wildlife in Gabon, for example, and Democratic Republic of Congo. And some of the studies show that it was females and young animals that were affected, and therefore wiping out the implications of population recovery. But one sector that has been widely affected that we work with and that I wanted to give an example of very quickly is the tourism sector. In Africa, where I sit, tourism is the source of most of the funding that comes in for conservation. But not only that, it is also the source of funding for governments, and governments use this money from tourism for health as well, and education and other social services. So the loss of tourism, that collapse, has not only taken away a source of revenue for the communities that take care of tourism, the rangers, the park operations, it's also taken away revenue from for government. And it's had all kinds of cascading effects, of course, because if I'm a community and I'm getting my money from this, it means now I don't have a job anymore. I don't have food anymore. I'm struggling. So tourism has really had all those cascading effects and has been an area that we've tried to look at. It has exposed our dependency, high dependency on international tourism, and really awakened us to the need to think about financing for conservation beyond tourism. What are those other sources, and how can we really convince, bring in more financing outside of that? And how can we also build our local tourism sector as well? We've had to think about emergency relief, because there has to be emergency relief to those communities that were dependent, but also thinking about then recovery. Another area we've looked at very quickly is green recovery. How do we recover in a way that is good for nature, that it does not end up causing harm? How can we influence some of the stimulus packages that governments are putting rightly towards health, but also to put them towards nature as a launchpad for recovery, for example, tourism being one of those. If we do not continue to invest in that sector, will the wildlife be there when we get out of this COVID-19? We need to make sure that we keep the lights on. And the One Health approach. Somebody said it was a teaching moment. It's been a teaching moment for us in conservation, because we have not spent as much time looking at the linkages between environmental health and human health and animal health. And now is the time for us to really strengthen this. This is the new narrative that we need to look at, and we're really looking closely at that. I will stop there for now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And, lots of very valuable comments and notes. One thing to note here is you brought up the example of tourism. Is it, reduced tourism also means reduced greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector.
Yes, yes.
For a long time, people have been, doing all these campaigns about no flights and stopping flights. Yes, here it comes, and we're not prepared for this thing that we were wishing for. So it is one thing to, as you said, a teaching moment that we learn also in the environmental community, that things are not as easy and trivial that, as we think or say or write about. And that is also something for us, a teaching for, nudging, or, a moment for us to nudge ourselves and ask if we really understand the world and how it operates and the differences between countries and regions and so on. What might work in the United States might not work in Europe, and what might work in Europe might not work in Africa and Asia. And this is something that we're learning today, how the responses are different, and we yet don't know who's doing a better job in the world. We're looking at numbers, but even numbers are changing very, very quickly. So, and Robert.
Okay, thank you, Kaveh. So as I introduce myself, I'm working for GIZ under a project that's really about protection and sustainable use of forest ecosystems and biodiversity in Laos. And maybe surprising to some, Laos is a very small country, but it's ranked number 4 for the largest volume of illegal wildlife trade in the world, both as a source country and as a transit country of wildlife from Africa, from other parts of Asia, because of its proximity, of course, to Vietnam, which is a large consumer country, China, Thailand, but also if you live in Laos and you know Lao people, there is a strong cultural affinity to eating wildlife, to hunting and consumption of wildlife. It's part of the cultural mindset in a sense. So, and that involves both, when we talk about government sector, it pervades through ministries, through the political level in parliament, through the business level, that, you know, if you want to treat someone special, you find the special menu at even the 5-6-star hotel to find the special menu of, you know, what's on that menu, of course, is unsaid. So with our project, in terms of this policy science discussion, one of our components is a FLECT, which is the Forest Law Enforcement, Governance, and Trade. And so we're working with the Lao government, Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, and also the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources. But especially for FLECT, it's math, to help them to, in the negotiations for the voluntary agreements, to be able to export legally, to meet the requirements to export their timber to the EU. Now, Laos is one of the countries that's had huge deforestation rate, illegal transboundary timber trade, again, to Vietnam and to Laos and to Thailand. And this is actually reduced a bit because of the new leadership in Laos. But at the same time, when we talk about with this COVID situation and being that this nexus of wildlife trade in Laos and being one of our also key components, we are now trying to, even though it's not part of the FLECT or the VPA discussion, negotiations per se, we are now bringing this into a discussion, this linkage between illegal or deforestation and wildlife, the wildlife trade, because it's really a lot of the illegal deforestation isn't the small share landholders, you know, it is some, but it really is the development projects, what we found in Laos, whether it's the dam building, road construction, they have the heavy equipment that when you go see the trucks going into Vietnam with huge logs, yeah, they need this equipment. So we're basically trying to bring this discussion within the nexus of illegal logging and timber trade. And just one final point, we're bringing to the forefront this into our communication strategy. And we're currently doing research, social research, related to sort of the tipping point of who are the connectors, the mavens, the salesmen, the transformers that can help us to sell this message within these influential sectors to change behavior, to change the mindset about wildlife trade, about consumption of wildlife. And this COVID situation definitely has impacted Laos a lot. We look at supply chains. I'm sure if they're going to sell timber to EU, that because of COVID, this will be a new point of discussion. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Cristina, you have to leave, right? And is it now? So if you're leaving before you leave, let me ask then, you know, just for, you know, final remarks and you know, two questions.
Oh my.
2 questions.
In a nutshell, actually, I still have about 10 minutes to go. So I've managed to do that. So,
let's combine that, you know, so I asked the next questions combined. So we hear about all these things. You talked about the, you know, the opportunities created, the need for the common narrative. We know about all the work, you know, good work being done. What are the capacities and, you know, and what we have at the national or intergovernmental level? So what can we do? What are the things to take advantage of? We also talked about the conferences of the parties and so on. And what are the challenges? We also need to respect the challenges that exist. At the same time, you know, yes, this is a moment that we learn how interconnected we are, right? A failure in China is having a result in the US, but at the same time, WHO is getting blamed for not taking action. Funds are getting cut, and countries are fighting over masks. And this is happening in the world, you know, developed economies, among those countries that were supposed to even help others, and that's not happening. So what are the real challenges moving forward?
Okay, well, actually, that's great. So if I understand correctly, you're sort of asking me about opportunities and challenges at once. And I think it's always best to start with the challenges, because where there are great challenges, there are always great opportunities as well to overcome those challenges, right? So I would say that in very broad terms, some of the greatest challenges that we face at the national level, we really desperately need to strengthen health systems, and we need to strengthen access to healthcare, which is, you know, extremely weak in so many countries that I'm sure many co-panelists are working in right now as well. We also really at the national level, because I think you said national, local, global. So we also clearly need cross-sectoral collaboration. I was very happy to hear, I believe it was Monika and Alice both mentioning One Health earlier. So yes, so I was talking about challenges because I think One Health is both an opportunity and a challenge. It's a challenge because it's not easy to collaborate across sector. It's easy to say that we're going to do so. It's easy to say we're going to bring, you know, the environment sector and the animal health sector and all these different sectors together, and the human health sector, and we're all going to collaborate. But in reality, when we're actually trying to do that on the ground, it's not quite so simple. And it's also not so simple because that's when the local also comes in, because it's not just about different sectors at the national level or different sectors at the global level agreeing with each other and saying, yes, it's true, absolutely, ministries of health and ministries of environment should be talking to each other. But then you've also got to consider that the real action, the people that are at the front lines of natural resource management, are the people at the local level. And unless there are mechanisms to meaningfully engage those people at the local level, then you can take all of the policy decisions that you want at the global level, you can take them at the national level, but then you won't be reaping the outcomes that you're seeking unless you've got that local engagement. That being said, national and global level provide tremendous and critically important strategic policy direction. So it's not just about, you know, often we're talking about, well, is it top down, is it bottom up? It's both. You actually need a bit of both. So yeah, so in terms of, so I think that those are some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities. Another tremendous challenge that we're facing, and one that I just can't say enough is talk about enough, is about the largely dysfunctional global food system that we have on this planet, right? We often talk about little bits and pieces and components of that food system, but very rarely, you were talking earlier about systems thinking, very rarely do we have a holistic, systemic view about how to address those challenges. And that is absolutely essential. Really bringing together, you know, it's much more than just the sum of its parts. It's much more than just thinking about, well, you know, how can biodiversity contribute to better nutritional outcomes, for example? Absolutely, that's vitally important. How do we empower smallholder farmers? But it's also about looking at it throughout the whole of the value chain, right? In the context of COVID-19, you know, I think as much as it has opened new avenues for collaboration and new opportunities to have conversations that are long overdue across sectors, it's also generated new challenges, because a lot of people in the general public, I'm not saying sectors themselves, I'm saying, but a lot of the media attention, if you will, has been around very targeted, single focus issues. It really hasn't been about, oh, well, let's look at this systemically and how do we approach this systemically. Why? Because it's harder to have that conversation. Why? Because it's harder to identify the entry points there, and because it really is about system transformation. So So yes, it is about engaging different stakeholders. It is about One Health. It is about working across levels of governance, but it's also about empowerment. It's also about having a broader systemic view, and ensuring that all of the voices that are traditionally neglected but deeply affected by these health outcomes, all of the inequities that are exacerbated by these health outcomes, are actually meaningfully addressed and compensated. And you can't do that through single focus issues. I was very happy to hear Robert speak about the complexities of the illegal wildlife trade. You know, I think it made very clear that it's not as clear cut and easy to address as one would initially like it to seem. So there are very many layers, and there are a great many stakeholders, and it's not just about health issues, and it's not just about environmental issues. There's a whole host of social, economic, cultural issues that also need to be considered holistically. And unless we do so, it will be extremely difficult to achieve any of the SDGs together, to achieve any of our stated goals together, and to say that we can successfully come to a healthy and green recovery, because it really does take all of us and all of those different layers. So anyway, I'm probably well above the 2-minute mark, or maybe 4 minutes because it was combined questions, but
yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for your very valuable and I would say eye-opening comments. And so there are many things to think about. And yes, we talk about the holistic approach and systems approach, yet how to implement things is the question. Then the other thing is, if we talk about everything at the same time, while we have institutions that have been designed to act separately and in silos, what's going to happen? Will we lose attention or not? Yes, we have talked about these things. Yes, we have talked about the chance of pandemics in the past, but look at the media. Even when the pandemic was killing people in the developing world, we were having people in the West writing articles saying why the world is paying so much attention to COVID-19. COVID-19 will be killing less people than air pollution. This is the environmental community writing these things. And if you keep talking about COVID-19, then the discussions will overshadow our climate change discussions. This has come from the environmental community. Now we understand that things are much harder, but as someone just asked, what do we do and how do we prevent things, and where do we start, where do we focus? We have limited resources, and all these challenges getting combined. What do we do, and how do we navigate through? Thank you, Cristina, for being with us, and I know you have to go. Take care.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to be able to join. I do apologize for the overlapping commitments, but it really was a pleasure to be a part of this panel. And I think just moving forward, if I could leave the other panelists with another thought, and then I'll look back on the webinar, and I'm sure it'd be very interesting to hear. But what you were talking about before, it's not about, you were talking about, well, placing all of this attention on COVID-19 takes away attention from climate change. I think that's absolutely a false dichotomy. It's not about one or the other. It's about how they interact with each other. And then you've also got to think about, well, there are certain things that we need to think about and that we have to do as an emergency response right now. So there is short-term planning that is absolutely essential, but there is also a long-term vision that is needed. And so how do the two connect together? I think that the wonderful people on this panel, yourself, would have a lot to say about how that can be further developed and brought together, rather than exacerbating the dichotomy between them, or false dichotomy between them. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
So I'm changing the order a little bit. So now let's go to Manal, and now next Alice, because I know Alice also has to leave. So change the order.
Thanks, Kaveh. Thank you for this interesting conversation. So I guess we're back to the question on generally capacities and services. So for us, a lot of our work is at national level and a lot at the workplace level even, and we deal with different sectors: agriculture, construction, mining, all kinds of different sectors that have different and specific needs. What we're seeing, I mean, and I also see the chat question that we received on prevention. So the concept of safety and health at work has always been to invest in prevention, because once accidents or occupational diseases do occur, it's very difficult to turn backwards and it's much more costly. So investing in prevention and creating a safety and health preventive culture is one of our main objectives. To do that, you need a certain infrastructure at the national level, and that requires infrastructure and capacity building in legislation, so changes at the national level in legislation, but also workplace level policies, but also guidance material and all of that. Also people to be trained in the right aspects. So for example, we've had a lot of questioning, do we consider COVID-19 as a disease contracted at work? And is it work related if we're getting it from colleagues, or even where it started in a marketplace, which is a workplace. And so we're trying to support countries to update their list of what is recognized as an occupational disease, because that makes the duty for employers and supervisors to prevent and put things into place to prevent contracting the disease, but also to compensate if people do get the disease. Another area is this issue that legislation plays a big role in, the right to removal. If people are feeling unsafe in workplaces, they have a right, if they have justification, reasonable justification, to remove themselves from work that seems dangerous to them without retaliation. And so this is, you know, capacity at the level of legislation and laws that protect people is important, but also infrastructure, the academic training for occupational physicians to recognize, diagnose diseases as such. And also what we're seeing is this issue of risk assessment. So to have prevention, you need to assess risk. You need to assess risk early on, and we can't forget the classical risks, non-communicable disease risks that lead to respiratory diseases and cancers and whatnot, but also these emerging biological hazards, communicable diseases and others, such as COVID-19, that we need to be assessing. And what we call on is comprehensive occupational safety and health management systems at the national and workplace level that actually are already prepared for emergencies, and do not wait for a crisis to happen to start, you know, planning their crisis response, but rather have an emergency planning and preparedness already planned. So the capacity to support countries in such preparedness is important. Health surveillance and monitoring, people having to take on new roles now, contact tracing and all of that. The links with technology and innovation are important to do that in a more sustainable fashion. So even the practices that I just want to mention quickly, I know I'm taking up time, there's a hierarchy of controls of what we're calling for. So there are risk assessment, but then there are control measures. And these measures start off by engineering, eliminating the risk, which in these cases we can't, or substituting it, but we can do that with chemicals, for instance. But for COVID-19 and the virus itself, obviously we need engineering controls. And so the choices you make by what shields you buy to make separators between desks or whatnot, or what disinfectants you choose to buy, or how often you use them, and the production process for these infection and the effect it has on the environment and people exposed to them for long hours. So these are issues to be considered. And this culture of single use, so now, you know, we're using masks, we're throwing them, we're using different things and throwing them, and the culture of protection at the expense of other sectors and other issues. So personal protective equipment is a last resort generally in prevention and in safety and health management. And now, you know, personal protective equipment is at the front line of fighting the virus. And so we need to make conscious decisions of which personal protective equipment we're promoting and how we're using it. We're using it in a way that is more sustainable or not. So these are all questions that we are focusing on, and obviously workers are different, migrant workers, vulnerable workers, women, and all of these we need to take into consideration as we address and build capacity.
And very briefly on challenges, and we know, where do you see the main challenges going forward?
So a challenge I'm finding is a lot on data collection and harmonization. So you've got different countries with their different registries and systems for collecting data. And we've had that challenge earlier in collecting occupational accidents and diseases and harmonizing in what is a disease and what is an accident. Is it the ones that cause 3 days off work or 2 days off work? And so it's very difficult to compare data if we're not using the same definitions globally. So for me, that's one challenge, as every country, you know, is using reporting and statistics globally on different, now the COVID-19, but I mean, other times different viruses or exposures that we may have. Yeah, so for there are so many challenges, obviously economic challenges for getting the market straight up again as it used to be, and we have to be ready that it is going to change. It was already changing, and I think we just fast-tracked into the future in many types of work arrangements and way of doing things, and that's going to continue to be a challenge to set people up for this change and to continue to find livelihoods across the world, you know, to fit the whole global chain as we move forward. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And yeah, so in not, you know, complex human nature systems, which are very non-stationary, we both have the issue of known unknowns, the things that we're, you know, searching. You know, when we search for data, we are trying to figure out the known unknowns, but we also have the issue of unknown unknowns, that as we go forward, we learn a lot of new problems, and we learn that our emergency responses and our good actions today can have a lot of impact. I mean, you mentioned disinfectants. You know, I've seen an interest in the research community to create some bio-friendly disinfectants, and at least in North America, I hear that it's very unregulated, or the regulations are not sufficient because they also kill a lot of, you know, useful stuff out there. Their uses, you know. So our response is that the impact is not limited to masks and PPEs and the waste that we are creating, but lots of other things. We're working on the internet search, the use in internet and new consumerism, you know, on our behavior in the virtual world, and how that increases the carbon footprint, water footprint, land footprint of our internet, and the videos, the cameras that we have on at the moment. Those are all huge, and the things that we are not ready for. So we yet have to understand the world, and we can never get a complete understanding of the world. So Alice, what do you think?
A lot has been said, so I don't have to say everything. I'll try to see if I can only cover a few things that maybe haven't been said in general. I think the capacity gaps, most have been covered. I think maybe one that we need to really talk about is better science, especially the better science in understanding the interconnections, because I think that's really where we're struggling. I mean, even when we try to look at the drivers, we realize that it's very hard to say. Sometimes one driver may appear to have the responsibility for the disease. Maybe we could say it's wildlife trade and it's the live market, but then you might also find there's another unrelated driver, and how you calculate the proportionality of which driver affects the other. It is not as easy as shutting down wildlife markets, because we know there are people who depend on them, either for livelihoods or depend on bushmeat for protein. So either you have to come up with alternatives, or you end up in a black market situation. So just that whole interdependency, we know that the need for food is what has pushed us into encroaching in wildlife habitats and bringing humans and livestock in closer proximity, raising that burden of disease. How do we raise more awareness on that and be able to solve that? The need for full cost accounting, full cost financial accounting of the social impact of disease. That is not quite there yet. We need to talk about that. Monitoring, of course, is a big one. Early warning systems, disease surveillance, particularly in terms of preventing pandemics, so that in future we don't have to do that. Sharing of the science-based solutions. I think we're all of us here are producing amazing science, but is it properly shared, and is it properly harnessed and used to inform more in policies that can really inform each other? The policy coherence is not there. I still think we are still in that silo. We need to break down those silos. COVID has really showed us really opened us up to that vulnerability that there's no conservation solution that does not, if you don't have a health solution or you don't have a human well-being solution. So all of these issues, they call for cooperation, and that's why that One Health approach is a big one that to talk about going forward. My one point I want to talk on climate change is the fact that when you look, the drivers are interconnected, because when you talk about deforestation resulting into exposure to pandemics, it does affect climate, brings about climate change. So maybe one solution then can actually solve those two problems together. So there are links in there. There are links to malnutrition. We know that people who are not very healthy will be more exposed to the pandemic. So there's a lot of that policy coherence we need to think about. There's a lot of discussion now in terms of the cancellations, the lack of travel. You talked about that, the reduction in emissions and the reduction in travel. Yes, I think maybe it could yield useful lessons for behavior change in future. The fact that we quickly changed our behavior, could we do the same for something else that is not this? I don't know. It is possible. But also just the need for global cooperation. I think that is going to be my last point, because there has been a lot of global cooperation towards efforts in terms of trying to address this pandemic. Could we also use that same level of global cooperation to address the climate challenge going forward? So cooperation, One Health, I will leave, those are the 2 points I will leave you with before I go. It was such a pleasure to be part of this, and I look forward to hearing, because I know it's such a rich discussion. There will be a lot of useful things coming through. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Thanks for your time and insightful comments. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Robert.
And now let's go to Monika.
Thanks very much, Kaveh. And since you borrowed from Donald Rumsfeld in your framing your comments, let me borrow from Winston Churchill and perhaps remind people that we should never waste a good crisis. And so in looking at how perhaps UNEP deals with some of these issues on capacity gaps, now let me be very specific, because we don't have a lot of time, and I think it's best framed in a couple of ways. So one of the ways in which we have been able to address things on the ground and perhaps at country level, given that we're largely a global normative organization and relatively small in the face of our colleagues such as WHO, ILO, or UNEP, and we work with other ministries. So at the global and at the regional level, we have interministerial meetings with the ministers of environment and the ministers of health, where we can bring these together and have open conversations and look at what's needed at the country level through the ministers directly at more of a political and a policy level. But that is one way of doing this. The other way, and let me use the example of our United Nations Environment Assembly, the UNEA, in which we get our mandates directly from member states. And I suppose as a direct example, and we've talked about pollution in the past and resiliency and the need for addressing pollution problems, the member states themselves have identified a number of capacity gaps that they would like to see addressed. And let me just quickly list them. So knowledge about pollution and its sources, the regulatory, financial, and institutional means of implementation, infrastructure for managing and preventing pollution, the awareness and the impacts of pollution on health, productivity, and the environment, and leadership from themselves, but also from the international community on how to direct and act on pollution solutions. And so the member states themselves tell us what they need in terms of the gaps that they see among themselves, and how do we work at that both at a global normative best practice level, and then how do we translate that in working with our UN agency colleagues who have a much greater footprint on the ground when we work together at these nexus issues, which is incredibly important when we're talking about resilience. The question that was in the question and answer was to look at how can we bring these integrated solutions to bear on what are very complex problems. And I think we've touched on, or Christine has touched on, things like food systems and looking at pollution. How do we deal with that from a resiliency point of view? And I won't go into some of the things that were discussed in the previous EMG sessions on building back better, for example, but making different choices, the opportunity to use this crisis to really change and transform the way that we look at the economic benefit that is derived from the resources, the natural resources that we use from the environment, and make better choices while still maintaining an economic benefit. And so, as Christine said, there are often false dichotomies that are presented to us as an either or, and that you must trade off one to get benefit from the other. But we have shown, and there are lots of examples where you can move toward economic beneficiation from the wise and the informed use of the environment and the natural resources that are available to us in a more sustainable way, so that we're not, stealing from our grandchildren, as it were. And that's the kind of thing that we do in partnership. And again, this is an EMG forum where the UN system needs to come to bear and bring the collective best knowledge and practices from across all of the disciplines of the UN system to deal with these kinds of challenges. And so I would like us to remember that in UN reform, member states themselves are telling us we see a huge gap just in the UN itself in terms of not working well together. So they're driving us to work together and to find those solutions on the ground by bringing in the kinds of concerns that are coming from the labor side, as Manal was saying, and from the health side, as Christine was saying, and also from the environmental side, which is our mandate. And we have so many examples that we could pick from, but I hope the two that I've given are able to show that that's exactly what we're doing. So I'll leave it at that and use up my 4 minutes in that way and go to the next question.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought it up. I was going to ask that later on, and we can discuss it further. That how can we address these deficiencies within the UN system? Because we're talking about the world to act in an integrated way and get out of silos and combine efforts and create synergies. But is happening at a smaller scale in the UN system or not? So that's something to discuss, and hopefully dialogues like this would be helpful in recognizing what's happening in networking among the different actors within the UN system and getting the efforts combined in a better way. So now let's go to Robert.
Okay. So just be quick on the key capacities and service provisions. I will be more specific and just narrow down or drill down into, I think that that practical, not theoretical understanding and application of system thinking as a concept, as a mindset, and with the use of the tools that are available, many of them recently being developed. I think there's a plethora of new and exciting tools, online tools, but practical tools as well. And bringing different sectors, interagencies are interministerial, and I've had experiences doing this both in Mongolia and also in Afghanistan. Maybe just to relate my experience in Afghanistan was with the SDG working group. So we had 28 ministries plus civil society organizations all coming together, and we essentially developed a shared understanding of what complexity and interdependence is, system thinking, over a 2-month period. And then together developed a shared understanding of the problems and how they're related together. One of the key tools that we used was one that we borrowed from SEI, which was a discussion visualization tool that looks at, I think it's called the interactive scorecard, where you take different SDG targets and you really have a discussion based on their scorecard about synergies and trade-offs, and that is a great way, I think, to understand the complexity and as Monika related and others about these maybe unforeseen synergies, but also the trade-offs and how we can mitigate those, right? So I think this shared understanding at a practical level together by the different agencies or the representatives by the ministries is very key. I think the second point is the shared best practice. I think there's a lot of good practice out there to dealing with complexity. And even with zoonosis pandemics like we're seeing, I think there are already examples of countries that have shown the way in various avenues. So if we can take those best practices and connect them to the system understanding of the implications of, say, a pandemic disease on different sectors, on the social, economic, and environmental spheres and well-being, then I think that would be a very key capacity and service provision that can be applied that's missing now. And yeah, just to iterate the oneness, the collaboration, the one UN sort of aspect, I think that needs more emphasis, and it needs system leadership. It needs leadership that is inspiring. It needs leadership that promotes deep listening, consensus building, and so forth. So I will stop there. I think those are the key capacities from my point of view. Yeah, that haven't been said.
Thank you so much. And I hear that Manal also has an issue and she has to leave. So is that right? Your eyes are not confirming.
No, I had thought this was 1.5 hours, so we have a staff meeting with plans, but I can be a little bit late. It's fine.
Okay. So if that is the case, one thing is that in the Q&A, keep your eyes at the Q&A section, and if you can provide alternative views and share your alternative thoughts, that would be great. So both the answered and unanswered questions. So one issue that I think some people mentioned. So Robert just talked about how to use the one tool to figure out and understand complexity. When you touch those tools, you realize how complex things can get. Over time, we have realized, the great overlap and nexus among the SDGs and what is happening, the targets that we are setting. Alice, before she leaves, she mentioned that you do something, for example, for deforestation. It has a benefit to climate change, or also like it has health impacts. Yet we talk about certain things more than others. So and now we have the issue of emergency response and responding to this thing, plus setting the global agenda and making sure that we don't lose track of long-term things that we need to get done. How do we do that? How do we balance these, short-term against long-term things, given that we are having, the world is struggling more. Now, you talked about, Monika, you talked about not wasting a crisis, and that is
as different sectors is not news. Key issues that we can be looking into is consolidating some institutional platforms together to share data and emerging evidence on, for example, the ongoing pandemic and its impact on various systems. We do have such systems starting to take place. There's lots of evidence of various agencies working together in a multilateral basis and also bilaterally on certain areas where mandates are joint. Even basic things like multi-sectoral policy briefs and other knowledge documents and materials to address these interdependencies that have been highlighted throughout this discussion could be useful for many of our stakeholders who would like a one-stop shop for a lot of this COVID-19 analysis. One key issue that I forgot to mention is our international labor standards, because there is this question, how do we ensure, integrating responses, and how do we ensure people actually take action and understand the impact? But there are international labor conventions, for instance, that provide protections and focus on a culture of workplace cooperation, for example, and social dialogue, and they're key to shaping recovery and preventing deterioration and ensuring a just transition, and ensuring that labor conditions during and after the crisis, because it's really, as you said, the different SDGs are linked, poverty and livelihoods and all the actions that we are taking across supply chains are impacting people. And so if governments ratify international conventions that provide for such protections, that's a first step in ensuring accountability and liability in some of the key policy issues that we are trying to to promote. So a few key issues for me would be, you know, merging some of our databases and institutional platforms, developing joint sectoral policy briefs on some of these issues that can, you know, can provide some policy guidance clearly. And the third is to rely on some of these international standards that we've already devised and are still pertinent in times of crisis, and can provide for protections if we call for them, and harmonize our national legislation to implement and reflect, you know, the protections that are already there. Yeah.
Thank you. Monika, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Kaveh. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to take things further. But I just want to introduce perhaps a couple of things and answer one of the questions on the Q&A, and that was around education. And I think what we need to be able to do is reach out to the young people of today. They're going to inherit the mess that literally we've left behind and are struggling with today. And certainly the UN Environment Program has a youth and environment program that we reach out with all of the good work that we're doing through our partnerships and through everything else, that we send out those messages and provide information to youth at universities and in networks for them to act on. And there are a lot of really good examples and opportunities for youth to make changes. And so we see that there's a short-term benefit from a lot of people making individual interventions, and I think being empowered to take that into their own hands and do something about it. So this is where, you know, many years of, you know, policy, best practice and science and that can come out into action by not only youth and through education sectors, but also by people who feel very strong and motivated to do things. I think on the ground from an institutional perspective, we've been able to look at filling those capacity gaps. And one of them has always been, and this comes to perhaps you know, some innovation here, where we need to work together more to leverage innovation is on the digital economy. You know, how do we look at the fast pace of change that the digital economy is bringing to us, and how do we leverage that? We often bemoan the fact that, you know, we don't have access to data, or the data is in inoperable formats, or the data is not reliable, and that. How can we look at innovations to make that data accessible in a very authoritative way to build the foundations for science, to policy, to action? And so there's a sector that is moving very fast, and we need to be able to jump on there and capitalize and use it. And then we can move fast as well in those areas where we can work with the digital economy. And I think the other area where we often underestimate as the UN, because our primary client and stakeholders often the government, but how do we engage the private sector? The private sector has a huge ability to make change very quickly. They have different business models and they have different imperatives, but it's one of those examples where you can influence the influencers. And the private sector is an area where we've been working on to help tackle a lot of the environmental issues, because the private sector is integrally involved in harvesting from and benefiting to our advantage the natural resources that we have. So, you know, if you want to move fast, you need to work with other people. There's another proverb from you know, a number of countries that have been moving very quickly and going together. So working, as I said earlier, with the UN entities that we are partners with, but also in the private sector and in perhaps lesser known partnerships outside of your area of direct response. So for the environment, you know, we could be working with other areas that's like health, through the One Health. What is our contribution to health? And so working at those nexus areas with partners, leveraging innovation and bringing in unusual partners, perhaps for us, such as the private sector, is a very important way to move fast and to look at short-term benefits as we also try to safeguard the future, as I mentioned earlier. So I think there are some ways that we can leverage our comparative advantage as the UN by broadening our scope and working with sectors who are able to move fast in taking our message and our imperatives forward. So I'll turn over to perhaps you again and allow Robert to answer this question, because I don't want to take up too much time.
Thank you so much, and let's hear Robert.
Yeah, I'll actually kind of jump off from what Monika talked about in terms of engaging the private sector. In terms of capacity gap, I see that the mobilization of resources, especially financial resources from many of these countries, is a problem. And I think what's going to be laid bare as things play out and our global economy starts to shrink is that the funding, I can see it already through my own project, is going to start to get tight. The ODA, even the foreign direct investment, is going to be tight because of the risk. And actually, you know, donor countries going more towards, we have to focus at home. So I think the capacity to mobilize, to be innovative, to use innovative financing, blended financing schemes is a capacity that is in short supply, but one is very much needed. So maybe bringing together the private sector with in blended financing with, say, like in Indonesia, Islamic finance. I know UNDP has the Innovation Finance Lab that they're working on various blended financing models to experiment with, whether it's zakat or green sukuk, and bringing together, say, Islamic finance with the private sector. So this blended financing is one capacity that I think is very lacking and is needed hugely. I think the other is also the challenge of building capacity across different levels, whether it's at a high level, policy level, or at the national level, and then we have to go subnational and local. And because of that need to interact and interface and to share and work together with having not, I would say, equal or equitable capacities in these various tools and these various approaches is a limiting capacity for acting collectively and dealing with some of the on-the-ground challenges. I think also linked to that is the lack of sufficient mechanism for knowledge management. Within, at the country level where I work a lot of times, there is a big gap, is that once capacity is built or research is done, it's lost. When people move on, it's lost, transferred. So this capacity for systemic knowledge management and skill knowledge transfer is a big gap that's, I think, missing. And yeah, and finally, I think linked to that question from the higher education, I do believe there's a gap that exists that is untapped, which is the expertise from higher education that could fill this gap of lack of capacity at national and subnational level, and to help with knowledge management and skill transfer. They are the core of educating the next generation of skilled people in all sectors. So if we can really work closely with the universities, the higher education institutions to fill some of these needs, to give them more priority, I would say that that's one of the other key gaps and challenges that we face.
Yes, Monika, you wanted to add? Yes. Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, given that there's fewer of us now, can we have a little bit more time? Because I'd like to also build on what Robert has just said, because you know, from the education perspective, I think what we need to also look at is ensuring that we have that continuum between what we are teaching in terms of sustainability and circularity in the economy and all of these great ways of thinking, and how do we build the demand for that in the employment sector so that governments and private sector and others see the benefit of these kinds of skills, and that there's that continuum that sort of pulls that skills and that capacity and therefore retains it in the marketplace. But we have to do both. We have to provide, and we also have to build that demand for it, I think, in the employment sector. I think the other thing that was brought up as well is around the question that came from the question and answer session around how do you prioritize between economic and health and environment and whatever. And I'll go back to what Christine said, and often we're faced with what appear to be false dichotomies. it really isn't necessary to have to choose one or the other. And again, I think we've been able to experience through this pandemic that governments were very quick to put trillions and trillions of dollars on the table collectively in terms of stimulus packages, both at the national level and to support other countries. But within those stimulus packages, there have to be informed choices on how to do things in a better or different way to prevent the kind of challenges that we've come to and being falsely forced into these dichotomies. And so there really is a choice that needs to be made. The evidence is there, the science is there to back it up, the examples and the best practices can be called upon, but it comes down to not only political will, we use that term very often, but also societal will to change behavior. How do we move ourselves from a particular comfort zone, and how do we demand that collectively of our governments who act on our behalf to say we want to move in a different direction, we don't want to go through this again, why can't we do things differently? And so we have to be bold in making these choices and giving the message to governments that we want, in fact, to move to a different kind of future, and there are ways of doing this. So again, we don't have to box ourselves into these false dichotomies. Economic beneficiation that we have enjoyed for decades is derived in large part from the environment and from natural resources. And therefore, it cannot be one or the other. It must be both. And a lot of work that UNEP has done over the years has been on greening the economy, the green economy. We talk about the blue economy. How do we look at sustainable economic choices, both from land-based and from marine-based resources? And a lot of the research is there, and a lot of the policy actions are there as well. And so we do have a basket to dip into of knowledge and expertise. And I think as the UN, we need to collectively keep helping our governments and our member states and society, including private sector, as I said earlier, to make those choices that move us in a different direction. And that's called transformation. And I think we're all about transforming the world that we live in, because we have discovered and we have learned that it's causing us problems. Messing it up from a pollution point of view, we're getting sick from all kinds of things, pollution, zoonotic diseases and whatnot. And so we have to get away from that paradigm of it's one or the other. The Sustainable Development Goals are built on that foundation of society, economics, and environment. And the three are inseparable. We have to start thinking like that. And the solutions are there.
Do we do that at the political level or intergovernmental level? Yeah, I mean, when we talk about like the science is there, but yes, we do talk about interconnections, but have the scientists really provided, the useful material for the policymakers to take actions? It's easy to say that we have to pay attention to everything. It's easy to say that, yes, like, you don't have to pick, between the options, and you can tackle the problems simultaneously. But at the end of the day, priorities are set by urgencies in societies. If a country is going down, is having internal conflicts and wars and other things, it can certainly not pay a lot of attention to the matters of long term, even if climate change didn't exist, even if environmental degradation didn't exist. We talk about it, so for example, let's say climate change. Climate change is one of the products of unsustainable development. But it's one of the topics that we have highlighted. It's the same as deforestation. It's the same as air pollution. It's the same as many other problems that are existing and today, and the world is sensing. Why do we highlight this particular problem? And then we have the developing world telling us that we have so many other things to deal with that we cannot tackle at the time that in the most developed countries of the world, people are fighting over toilet paper. Do those people think about the future of this planet? Can they have that, do they have the capacity to think about the future of this planet? And if toilet paper is a concern here, like in other parts, food is concerned, like, health is concerned, war and terrorism are the concerns. Can we expect those people to really handle these things together? And another question, which is, I think, important and is being asked here is, beside the integrated approach that I don't know how we can materialize. At the end of the day, we also need to mix the bottom-up and top-down approaches that I think Cristina also mentioned that. How do we do that? And we talked about education and so on, but can we really mobilize, you know, the societies and get them take action? Let's start with Robert and then Monika.
Sorry, I was typing into the Q&A. Yeah, so how can we mobilize action, and what are the opportunities for collaboration? Again, I would probably just play off what I had already said about, and what Monika said, we need to stop seeing things as either or and actually reduce our tendency to see problems very linearly in a reductionist way. So we don't see the whole problem. We don't see the connections. We see that, like with the banking crisis or with the economic downturn that has resulted from the markets and the disruption to supply chain, this stimulus to the banks and to the small businesses, even less so, but there. But how about the childcare areas? I mean, now people are out of work, but they also have children who are out of school. So I think we have to understand the connections, the wider systemic. There is this tendency, as we've talked about, to want to prioritize or to put things in hierarchies. But the world is non-linear, very much so. So we have to reduce our tendency to want to prioritize based on maybe what we see as the event that's taking place. If we think of the world and what we see as the system iceberg, we see the events, right? And that's what we react to, because we have to, of course, put out the fires. But we have to understand, are those events that we see over time linked together? Are there trends that should be paid attention to? Obviously, we can see the climate change trends. And what are those trends linked to? They're linked to system structure, obviously. System structure generates a behavior response of a system. So that's what produces the trends that we see over time. So we have to understand that if we only link or set our thinking and our policy making, our governance to a binary prioritization of what we think is important, that usually is the solution is actually often counterintuitive. Let me put it that way. And I think Jay Forrester, back in the 60s, one of his great ideas was that, you know, he was looking at the problem of poverty, and everyone says economic growth is the solution to poverty. But he said, actually, that actually exacerbates poverty in many ways. We have to think counterintuitively. It's not just putting our cards into economic growth. We need to build health. We need to build equality. We need to build access to services. We need to bring up women, and we need to protect children. All of these things are interlinked. So I was.
Of course, you're said then, you know, done, but hopefully we can get there and take advantage of the lessons we're learning today to you know, solve the problems that we have. I think we discussed this yesterday as well, that we are trying to solve our unprecedented problems of the 21st century with using the institutions that created them and had been designed, you know, long time ago for a different world. But that's the way we think. We even try, you know, some people try to put value on the health of people or ecosystem services and balance things against shutting down economies and so on. Monika.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Kaveh. And I think Robert, you know, is making some excellent points there. And we have become a society, and I'll speak globally as well in many dimensions, become a society that really depends very much on our technological superiority and innovation of the past. So we always look for a cure. You know, something happens, oh, give us a cure, we need a vaccination, as opposed to the prevention. So preventative medicine versus curative medicine. And, you know, it's almost as if we don't want to take the responsibility at the time to do what it takes to invest in prevention, so that we don't have to have this knee-jerk panic reaction to the cure and say, wait and wait and wait for, you know, the silver bullet or the vaccination or whatever you want to call it. So I think we do have to shift. And I again go back to Winston Churchill and saying, you know, don't let this good crisis go to a waste. Let's understand that, you know, we do need to invest in foundational institutions, and you will get immediate and short-term benefits from doing something like that: education, health, environmental systems, economic innovation, financial innovation, those sorts of things. And Robert talked as well about, you know, systems, the way we work at systems. Well, system disruptions also are an opportunity for us to make change, because we've now experienced those kinds of disruptions on every level we can think of. And we've started to see some solutions and some changes, and we need to capitalize on it. So again, it does come down to a lot of political will, and I think some what's the word I'm looking for? Some bold and some very, I think, risk-taking to look at new ways of doing things. And people will jump on bandwagons, and we need to make those bandwagons available for people to jump on, so that they can see that there is a future to go to. And that's why it's so important to put out positive messages, to give those examples, to continue to highlight where, you know, things are working well. And you brought up, you know, the issue of, well, there is a lot of science out there. Science is not perfect. I've spent my entire life being a nerdy scientist, but we cannot let that one question kibosh, you know, all the other good science that's there. And we shouldn't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good, as they say. And yes, look at what is the best course of action with the preponderance of information that is available, and therefore minimize our risk in going forward in the choices that we make. And I think that's where we have to get away from the absolutism of binary choices, as Robert was saying, to say, you know, we have to make these changes, and the chances that we will do good out of them outweighs the absoluteness of knowing that it is or isn't one thing because of perhaps an issue of risk or lack of knowledge. So science will never be perfect. We'll continue to learn, and we're supposed to be the smartest species on this planet. Hey, look at a bunch of RNA and a bit of lipids and protein called a virus, and it's kind of outsmarted all of us. So, you know, we really do need to take this and look at what is it that will give us the best chance of doing better in the future, as opposed to the absoluteness of this versus that. And I see Robert itching to say something.
Well, it just brings up to mind this whole idea also of leverage, right? Where are we going to intervene? And if I refer to Donella Meadows' work, Leverage Points, Places to Intervene in Systems, she identified eventually 12 places, right? And there are low impact leverage points, things that we do, but they're not game changers, you know, like changing parameters at the physical level. But they're important, but we don't stop there. Let's say we increase the number of women in leadership, right? In community councils, in maybe scientific committees, engineering, whatever it is. That is a start, but it's not the game changer. But eventually, over time, of course, it's changing something at the bottom of this iceberg that I referred to. What is it that maintains our design systems? It's people. It's people with a mental model, a worldview, who have values, assumptions, beliefs of how the world works, right? And so essentially that is the highest impact leverage point, but of course the most difficult. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And she said the ability to transcend paradigms is the most powerful, and that's been the block of science and technology. We love our theories, right? Our whole careers are wedded to our theories. And so that has blocked innovation, that has blocked new ideas. that could be, you know, some of the game changers. So we really have to be promoting this from, I would say, understanding system thinking as a way of being, which means we understand we're open to different perspectives, right? Yeah.
Yes. So thank you so much, both of you. I think we have to wrap up. There is a lot out there to be learned. Also, this pandemic is teaching us, you know, when it comes to imperfect knowledge and the fact that if you're dealing with the complex systems, our knowledge will be limited forever. So science can never get it, you know, completely understood, and that's actually a fact, and we have to live with that forever. There is a lot to be learned, but it's also an opportunity for policymakers to reach out to the scientists, or decision-making agencies to reach out to the scientists and define the problems more, you know, properly. So often in the scientific environment, we solve arbitrary problems or make assumptions that don't exist in reality. So that, I think, that gap can be filled as well, the gap between decision-making scientists and the real world. Today, we're seeing that governments on their own cannot succeed in solving the problem and tackling this problem. We need societies to respond and also be part of the solution. So that teaches us a lesson about the you know, how incomplete our approaches, top-down approaches, can be. So we talked about the opportunity, you know, during the last 3 days, about the opportunities created by this crisis, the limitations that we have, the gaps that to be filled, and also a great amount of work that is being done, interest at the global level, a golden moment to set a new agenda and do things differently, building back better, and revise the way we have been thinking about the world and our interlinkages. I'm thankful to UNEMG, to all participants, to Hossein, Nina, and others behind the scene who have made this possible, and to our participants and the esteemed panelists of the, last 3 days, who made these discussions very interesting, I would say, at least, and a learning experience for me. Hopefully these things would lead to better collaboration and more efficient response to our problems. Thank you. Hossein, over to you.
Thank you, Kaveh. Thank you, distinguished panelists. What a wonderful exchange. I was just jotting down and ensuring that we have taken note of the important points that were made, hopefully to allow us to have a good summary of this discussion, which will make it available to the panelists for the comments, and later on to the participants. We will not leave this discussion only as a discussion. We would like to build on this and perhaps try to see if we can develop some sort of a collaboration around this nexus more in the future. As it was mentioned by Monika and the others, it is very timely and, as a matter of fact, very opportune to see that there will be intergovernmental processes postponed to next year on biodiversity, on chemicals, and on other socioeconomic forums, where there will be more understanding of nature and its solutions to overcome many of our socioeconomic problems, and also vice versa, also within the environmental domain, to have a better understanding of the socioeconomic challenges facing human being, equality, equity, and the human rights related issues, also to bring them into the context of future environmental decisions. So it's really a two-way road for all of us to take it. And there are also areas that we need perhaps to explore more. I mean, there was references to a lot of trade-offs that we have to recognize. We shouldn't shy away from them. And it is good to go through them and to realize that there has to be discussion around them as opposed to forgetting them. We've really, I think, achieved some kind of objectives relating to exploring various activities, various policies and initiatives that organizations have put in place in responding to the challenge, but also in framing the future course of action as well as opportunities for collaboration. So we would like to really make a good summary of all these thoughts. Thank you, Kaveh, for being available for the last 3 days and putting your time there. I know what does it mean when having courses and lectures and students to manage, and at the same time committing to these types of assignments. But we will make sure that this will not be wasted, and it will be sort of useful to our next round of actions and thoughts. Thanks also to the distinguished panelists, and we would like to stay in touch with you. Thanks to Nina for being there, sort of ensuring that this will happen. We will again continue our deliberations over this Nexus way of thinking in our future Nexus dialogues, coming up with the series on environment and human rights interlinkages, focusing on climate, focusing on biodiversity and the overall environment human rights issues in terms of the human rights fighters and the others. So there is going to be more in the future. Stay tuned to our Nexus Dialogue pages on our website. And if you have also any comments to give to us in enhancing our future dialogues, please do not hesitate to share those with us. With that, and in order not to delay and allow the others to and the colleagues to move on with their other assignments, thank you so much for you and to you, and wish you good luck and best of wishes for the rest of the week and also the weekend and more ahead of you. Thank you so much, and have a lovely afternoon or continuation of the morning. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Thanks, Hussein. Thanks, Kaveh. Thanks, Robert and Nina. And thanks to the participants for the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Khap kun khap.